the Rav went on all of you. So thank you all for joining, and well, I'm very excited to do the chabura with you guys. So we're going to do it virtual, and we have a very fun topic, which I won't say who, but it's one of the three of you had asked me about in the past, and we are finally doing it tonight, which is the question. We're going to deal with a few questions. Here's the scenario that we're dealing with. Let's say, well, it's not let's say, it's a real case. A woman and a man, keep track of the different factors here. Woman and a man, they get married with a conservative rabbi. Into their marriage, they realize that the man realizes rather, that he has homosexual proclivities, he's gay. And so therefore they want to get divorced because they see it's not going to work out. They get divorced through a conservative rabbi. She gets remarried she's married to a second man and has children from that marriage. Should we be concerned that the get was not done properly, which is a pretty good chance it wasn't, and that the children potentially could be mamzer? The children could potentially be prohibited from marrying into the Jewish people. Very serious ramifications. On top of the fact, of course, also that would mean, if they're mamzer, that would mean that their mother and father were committing snus, were committing adultery on a halachic level. So that's the question that I would like to deal with you guys tonight. So there's three things.
Just a quick question. Was the initial marriage Orthodox, did you say?
It was not. So good. So that's a factor. Conservative marriage, guy realizes he's gay, they get divorced through another conservative rabbi, and then she gets remarried to a second man, has children with that man. Are we concerned that, and there's reason to believe they may be married, but the divorce was not done halachically correct, and therefore we might have a mamzeris issue on our hands.
And also, we're specifically talking about, say, conservative as opposed to reform or any other denomination?
Very good, very good. So if you guys can look at the source, if you have access to it, again, if you're all like doing the dishes and whatnot, it's okay. But if you're following along, not the source sheet, in the tshuva, the Minchas Usher that we're looking at, in the Minchas Usher here, on the second page, on Reish Yud Beis, he doesn't even, I can't even ask your question, Daniel. What he points out is he says, for Moshe may have or someone else may have used the term reform, and we're dealing with conservative. But if you look at the bottom of the first paragraph on Reish Yud Beis, he says, Va'av dan v'rav reformi, u'benito di dan, and in our case, meduber v'rav conservati, we're dealing with a conservative rabbi. But to be honest, for our purposes, Rav Asher Weiss says, Nira de'ein beinehem ela mashmos dorshin. There's no difference between them. It's just a matter of how you darshan it. There's no halachic difference between them, what you call them. De'ein bein nevela l'shreifa v'lo klo. And he says, basically, for all intents and purposes, whether you want to say something is aser mishum nevela, you want to say that it wasn't shechted properly, or it's a treifa, shechted properly, but it's a treifa, it's a hole in the tongue or something. However you want to slice it, they're both usher. They're both problematic for the same reason. So, Dan, to your point, Rav Asher Weiss assumes that they both have the same level of soul. But Evan, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say the time the year when this tshuva was written is probably important, right? Because if you think about when Rav Moshe wrote his tshuva, right, it was quite a while ago, and the conservative movement looked very different than it does, at this point in time. So I don't know if Rav Asher Weiss's tshuva was written more recently, or if it was written 20 or 30 years ago. My guess is that at this point, Rav Moshe, right, to the extent that there's any difference at all, or was any difference at all, right, you'd say at this point it probably more or less evaporated in terms of our view on it. But, if the tshuva was written 40 or 50 years ago, then maybe there is a significant difference between the conservative and reform movement.
Right. So Evan, I think that's an excellent point, and welcome to our friend Matthew Shlita. Thank you for joining. So Evan, to your point, yes, that's very important to keep in mind the years when the tshuvas are written. I think the Minchas tshuvas, I mean, they have to be fairly recent. You know?
Right.
Rav Asher Weiss, thank God, is alive and kicking very well. But Rav Moshe's reality of conservative Judaism, in fact, I remember asking Rav Tendler about this, and Rav Moshe, depending on which conservative rabbi you asked him about, he would say, like off the record, that yes, this guy, his, Kiddushin, the marriage he did, I would fully recognize. Which is a contradistinction to the very tough language that Rav Moshe used in his original tshuva. So, but before I jump into that, very quick overview of the questions we need to deal with. There are 3 questions we want to deal with over here. 2 of them are about the validity of the Kiddushin. 1 of them is about the validity of the get. Validity of the get is just very simple. Can we trust that this conservative Beeston actually did a proper gerushin? The question regarding Kiddushin is twofold. Number one question is a marriage performed by a conservative rabbi, is that considered valid and recognized by halacha? Number 2, maybe, even if the Kiddushin is recognized, we could say it was a mekach tov, that this woman, she didn't realize she was marrying someone who was not attracted to her, and therefore, had she known that he was gay, she would never have gotten married to him. So this is the same thing we have in monetary law. If you buy something under false pretenses, you enter into an agreement under false pretenses, then to mekach tov, it's not that you have a right later on to exit the agreement, it's that the agreement never took effect from the outset. So maybe that's what's going on over here as well. And Rav Asher Weiss's goal actually is dafka to find a way to invalidate the Kiddushin, because by invalidating the Kiddushin, if she was never married originally, then, let me just let somebody in. If she was never married originally, then the whole question of her validity of her divorce never gets off the ground, which means there's never a question of Mamzer, of the status of her second children, of her second marriage. Because there would be no second marriage. She was never initially married to begin with. There's no concern of adultery. So that's really what Rav Asher Weiss is dealing with here. Welcome, Steve Shlita.
Just a quick question.
Yes, Daniel.
Does it matter if the first husband knew that he was gay at the time of marriage? Say, for some reason, it's a late in life discovery, and he goes into the initial marriage thinking that he's straight, and then somehow, I don't know how it works, he somehow figures out during the marriage that he's gay. So he had full essential kavanah during the initial marriage for it to be a valid marriage, and even retroactively, the wife would also have thought that, right? It's only, say, during the marriage where somehow he figures out actually he's gay. Does that make any difference?
Right. You know what I would say? Again, I don't want to make this analogy because it sounds like I'm calling people who are gay, problematic. I don't want it to come off this way. But it's almost, at the time, if someone marries a person and then they develop later on in life, a critical illness that the person would never wanted to get married to begin with, had they known that they would have to endure such a condition, such a lifestyle, whatever it might be, do we say that that's a mekach tov? That's harder to argue if it wasn't a pre-existing condition. So Daniel, I appreciate the nuance you're bringing into this. If the man never realized that he was gay, and it only, whatever that means, developed at a later stage after they were married, it'd be much harder to argue that we can invalidate the Kiddushin from the very beginning if the condition that we're using wasn't existent, wasn't extant at the time. So let's say, and I could argue somewhere in there, that's the issue with psychology in general, is that many things people have, people are predisposed to develop them, and it just requires the right environment to trigger that predisposal. So again, I don't know enough about theories of sexuality, and I don't want to pretend that I do, but that's my general understanding. Okay, so yes, Matthew.
So I don't know if you saw the question in the chat.
I'm still learning how to use Google Meet.
I don't know how to use this either, but I just didn't want to skip over. My question is when it comes to a marriage being valid, does it matter that the person performing the ceremony is of a certain observance level, or that they perform the necessary actions that have to occur at a wedding? Because there's something in halacha where I feel like it would matter of the person themselves versus what actually happened.
Excellent point by Matthew. So what Matthew says is, wait a minute, and we're going to get to this very soon. A marriage doesn't require a rabbi. Now, we don't like to tell people that because rabbis want their honorariums. No, I'm just kidding. Because what's the rabbi doing? The rabbi is facilitating the Kiddushin. It's called a Mesader Kiddushin. You're being Mesader. You're setting it up. You're facilitating. You're not the one who does the Maisa Kiddushin. The rabbi doesn't wave his magic wand and then all of a sudden this man and woman are married to each other. In fact, this is going to get to really the heart of the matter. Why did Ramosha Feinstein consider the marriages performed by most conservative rabbis and certainly Reform to not be recognized by halacha? So looking at top of Reisha Days, because we would assume who's generally the frummest guy at a wedding. We assume generally the frummest, most observant person there, you would hope, is the rabbi. You would think the rabbi would be among the most observant people there. So if the conservative rabbi...
But that's not true in today's day and age.
Okay. So I'm going to give you one more factor, just one more factor.
Okay.
So the conservative rabbi. Then at the bottom of the page, he says, what was the scenario over here? The gavam, I'm just skipping from underline to underline, giving you the highlight. The gavam klape akahal. Now, when you go to a chuppah, there's two styles doing it. Either the rabbi is facing the audience, or the bride and groom are facing the audience, and the rabbi has their back to them, except for when he gives his spiel. So here, the bride and groom actually had their backs to the audience, and so the only people who were really seeing them as they did the Maisa Kiddushin were the rabbi, the two Adam up there, and the relatives. So we know relatives obviously are puzzled. Krovim can't testify. The rabbi, by virtue, he says, what's his line? You look at the end of the first paragraph on the page. Sorry, not that one. He says, sorry, at the top of the page. This is the Chiddush over here. Even this conservative rabbi, for all intents and purposes, he keeps Shabbos, he keeps Kashrus, he doesn't drive to shul, he's like really abiding just like an Orthodox rabbi. He says, Hustle hu le'edus, he's hustle. He says he can't give testimony in Jewish court, he's disqualified. Mishum she'etzem tafkido yeshbo kfira uminus bein sarkabos edus puzzle. Because this person fundamentally, by adopting an ideology which is against rabbinic Judaism, automatically, by virtue of adopting and propounding such an ideology, is automatically disqualified from giving testimony in faith. So this guy is invalid, and the witnesses, chances are invalid as well. That's Ramosha Feinstein's argument, by the way. Rav Asher Weiss, this is like really intense. He says, well, like what you were timing. He says, you know what, look, there's someone to go to today. I was at a wedding, I remember, of a friend of Marissa. So her friend is a conservative rabbi. Oh my God, it was very scary. He got up there, and whenever a rabbi gets up there and he gives you a 5-minute introduction about how his speech won't be long, and you're like, that introduction was already long enough. You're in for hell. So I won't give any names. You don't know the people. So the conservative rabbi did the wedding, and the Orthodox rabbi from their community, he was kind of like there on the side, just ensuring that there wasn't any mistakes that the conservative rabbi did. That was like that's Moshe Yisrael. But no, Matthew, you're absolutely right. That just because the person's the rabbi there, I mean, in general, it's one can't assume that someone just because they have a named rabbi and it's their name means that they're the firmest person in the room.
And would Rab Moshe and Rav Asher Weiss, they both dismiss any sort of Maisa Bia and say, there's no Kiddushin there because they don't have intent to be married through that?
Okay, very good. So that's on page Rashid Dalit. Sorry, yes. So what Evan's referencing, and we'll get to it in a moment, I'm glad you guys are bringing up all the ideas right now, is that there's a chazaka, you see that long abbreviation there on page Rashid Dalit?
Oh, yes.
Chazaka in section B. Ein adam osa bila so bilas disnus. In general, people don't want to live in sin, if we could borrow a Christian formulation. If someone is living together with a woman and they are having intercourse, they're having intimacy with one another, then we presume they want to do it in order to be married to each other. But Rav Asher Weiss says, I'll just tell it to you right now since you brought it up, Evan. Rav Asher Weiss says, are you kidding? I mean, I wish that's how people thought nowadays. But he writes on page Ratio Dala in the section B, second paragraph in the underline, the Kava Gomer, the Dorenu Dor Parut Hagorua Mistova Mora, certainly in our generation, which is worse than Sodom and Amorah, with practice special nus, and certainly when it comes to issues of sexuality, Shanat Gaher Gomor, that people are just sleeping with one another. It's not even, there's no guilt, there's no shame. It's become, he has to say precisely, it's become basically a lichatchila, where people, before they're ready to get married, they live together for a few years and they try it out. And that's it's antithetical to Jews. We can't even fathom such a thing. But that's become the norm of the world, I guess the Western world, and that's something untenable. But the point being, from a halakhic standpoint, is therefore we can't assume that by virtue of them living together, he has some sort of intention when he's having bia with his girlfriend that he wants to be married to her, because it's very much the norm today that people will live together, l'davonenu, and they won't be married.
But just a question on that, though. How can we say that they won't be thinking that? Because, after all, they're paying for this big wedding, they're having tons of guests, they're wearing a wedding dress, he's wearing a nice suit and everything. And now
they think they're married from the chuppah, right? So you'd say that they don't even need to have kavanah, that the bia is...
Oh, very good, very good. Okay, let's back.
Well, hold on. Before you answer that, also consider the fact that this is a person who doesn't realize he's gay, which means that he probably hasn't had relations before the wedding, and maybe realized on the night before Bia that he's not interested in women. So you can't count on Bia being the way that...
Interesting. It would seem from the scenario that, I didn't read it, I'm not reading through every single piece out loud here because I value your time, so I'm trying to give you the highlights, but it seems from the scenario that he only found out later in their marriage, but that's an interesting point, Sean. Like, if he already knew at earlier, what would the implications be for the Maisa Bia that they had on the wedding night? That's a great point. All right, so now I forgot. Daniel, your question and Evan's response again, what was it?
So my point was, how could you say it's not a wedding if, from the bride and groom's perspective, they're hosting this big wedding, they have a nice wedding dress, they have loads of guests, he's wearing a fancy suit, they've now bought a house together. From their perspective, they're living together as man and wife.
'Very good. To which, Evan, you responded?
Well, hold on. Before you answer that, also consider the fact that this is a person who doesn't realize he's gay, which means that he probably hasn't had relations before the wedding, and maybe realized on the night before Bia that he's not interested in women. So you can't count on Bia being the way that...
Very good. To which, Evan, you responded?
that they might be living together as man and wife, but none of the acts of Kiddushin take place with the Kavana because right. I think because you must have to say that, right? Because they don't think they did anything wrong. They think they're fully married already just from the chuppah and the ceremony and the whole thing. So they wouldn't have specific Kavana like by any of their actions that would qualify halachically to marry them other than the chuppah.
Very good. So the point that you're making, Evan, if those who are following inside, turn to page Reish Tes Vav on the top and the underline. What Evan's referencing is a Gemara in Ksubos and Ayin Gil Hamad Beis, which said that if somebody assumes that they are already married when they are having intimate relations with the woman they're living with, that Ma'aseh Bia will not constitute. It won't be a way for them to become married to each other. Why? Because when they were having Bia, he's like, I'm already married to this woman. So he's not having kavanah to do it for the purpose of marriage. He's assuming he's already married to this woman based on the wedding ceremony that they have. But to which, I think, again, gets to Daniel's point, which is, well, again, no, if they're having this whole wedding ceremony, and Matthew, like you pointed out, the conservative rabbi, let's say he does everything right. Let's say let's say the witnesses were fully kosher, two very upstanding, good Jewish people. They both come to the young men's chabura, on every other Wednesday night or whenever they're able to. Right, good, upstanding people who like learning Torah, like keeping Torah, and those are the witnesses at the wedding. They should be married, right? No reason to invalidate it just because of our prejudices against conservative rabbis. According to Moshe Feinstein, Ein Hachinami, it probably would be recognized as a valid Kiddushin if you could confirm all the facts. The Chiddush that Rav Asher Weiss writes in his tshuva, I know we jumped a little bit all over the place, but if you turn back to page Reish Yud Beis.
Sorry, just one question, Rupert. I apologize. Not really specific to this case, but in general, right? If you're a posek and you're approached in this type of case, right? You're sort of kula hunting, right? You're not looking to right? So is that important here when we think about this? Like if you ask Rav Asher Weiss this conceptually without a specific case where he was trying to free kids from being a mamzer, do you think that he might think about this differently than the specific tshuva here, where he has a very specific objective and he's trying to do something with kula?
Right. So Evan, I think what you're touching on is a broader discussion, which is really deserving of its own chabura, which is the place of bias in the halachic process. When I enter into a scenario, and I've already made up my mind what I'm trying to get out of the sources, does that cast aspersions on the legitimacy of my psak? So, but we see that all the time, by the way, in halacha. The Aduna shilas that came after 9/11. I mean, that's just one salient issue that I can think of off the top of my head. Clearly, all the rabbis there intended to find a kula to help all the women who were agunos at that point. So we do see that as accepted within a halachic system. But one needs to ask is, well, when is it okay to have a predetermined outcome that you're trying to reach, and when is that considered to be tampering or what's the word I'm looking for?
Sabotaging?
What was that?
Sabotaging?
Sabotaging?
Sabotaging.
Tainting was the word. When does it, but sabotaging is good also. When does it taint the halacha purely? Because like one of the things we always say, especially in like the YU world, is, you see that person, whether the way they learned that sugya was they're feminists and they wanted to find a solution that would make things as lenient to be able to include as many people as possible and let women do whatever they want. So we say, so the person has tainted intention. But when is intent considered tainted, when it's not considered tainted? So you could argue when someone is trying to, their goal is a goal that is a Jewish value, and you can find halachos that support it, then it's something that's okay to do. saving an aguna a woman from being an aguna is clearly a Jewish value. It's as early as Mishnayos that you have sources where we rely on the testimony of not just a woman, but a single woman about a man dying to save a man from being a woman from being an aguna. So a much broader topic. One last instance I'll share with you. Rabbi J.D. Schachter is always very fond of quoting this. That Rav Soloveitchik, he wrote a letter, Dr. Belkin, would that make sense? I don't know my YU history. Basically arguing why REIT students should become chaplains in the Army for whatever war, I guess it'd be Vietnam maybe, that was going on at the time, that YU should be encouraging its students to become chaplains for the war effort. So he says at the beginning, I already have come to a conclusion, but now provide you with the sources to back it up. So it's a great question. It's a great question, and Matthew.
One other question. In the time that Rav Moshe lived, a lot of conservative rabbis were much more similar to Orthodox rabbis than today. So the things that would go on at a wedding that was under conservative auspices would be more like that of an Orthodox wedding as far as the basic items. Today, maybe you have other things that would happen at a wedding. Would any of those invalidate the Kiddushin in a way that would be so antithetical to Orthodoxy or antithetical to traditional Judaism that it would therefore invalidate the wedding? I mean, I know like people won't have like ring ceremonies where the wife gives the man a ring. Like with that,
very good.
Sort of
I'm so glad you asked that, Matthew, because we are literally he literally brings up the ring ceremony part right here. So to your point, Matthew, right. So Evan already started going in that direction, talking about the distinction between conservative rabbis in the earlier days of the movement were basically almost indistinguishable from modern Orthodox. I mean, it's kind of what you see today with like a YU and YCP and the Open Orthodox and all that distinctions, but as time goes, it begins to diverge more. Similar phenomenon. So this is Rav Asher Weiss's point. Ramosha basically stops a step short from arguing that a conservative ceremony is fundamentally invalid. He says the conservative rabbi is not a kosher Eid, not going to have other kosher Eidim, so therefore, basically all conservative ceremonies we assume by default are not valid. But Rav Asher Weiss, for the very reason you're mentioning, Matthew, argues that no, a ceremony that is overseen, that's officiated by a conservative or reform rabbi, is fundamentally problematic. And this is a really great point over here. If you look, page Rishon Beis, where I put some Roman numerals. So one reason to invalidate the Kiddushin, or to not recognize the conservative Kiddushin, is that there are no kosher Eidim. Rav Asher Weiss said, in addition to two fundamental issues. Number one, I'm actually going to read it inside. It's very important. Roman numeral number 2, where I wrote that. Ha'echad, kol musluk ha'kiddushin, lefi mishpat Torasenu ha'kedosha, husha ish mekadesh v'kones ha'isha. Kiddushin in the Torah fundamentally means that the man is being koneh, literally translated as acquiring the woman. Now yes, even though the Rishonim point out it doesn't mean he literally owns her, she's not chattel in that sense. Mikol mako ki yikach siv. Nonetheless, the Torah says when a man will take a woman, and therefore the mode of acquisition must be used. Mishum kach b'nosna eve amrei ain't confusion cloud. Therefore, since it's ki yikach, that he will take her if she tries taking him instead. That is not kiddushin according to the Torah. Tfisa zoso seres l'chalutin es kol musag hanisuin sha'ol hamadurni shalpiv ein kan eles kashus chayvus hadots mishinuyis. This, of course, is antithetical to what we assume in Western culture today, that marriage is a completely level, egalitarian, even, level field between the man and the woman. Therefore, since this man and woman, they tell us that under the chuppah, they exchange, this is the point you pointed out, Matthew, they exchanged rings with each other. Who nasan lav, he nasan lav, he gave to her, and then she reciprocated. Lefia niosdaiti, near the machin kach, kivnu hamekash miskadeshes, ain kan kiddushin klam. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah says, if that's the intention that they had, the entire kiddushin is not valid because it's missing the fundamental underlying principle of kinikach, of the man taking her. Zos va'od, he said, not just that, but then also, I think Matthew and I think someone else pointed it out. You'll forgive me for not giving you credit. You can tell me who it was if you remember. Zos va'od, b'nisun ezrachim v'gam b'nisun notzrim, hapakir o hakomer came hanosin tokep la'etzem hanisun v'eskashas kasher abal v'isha ragnadim ritzon v'kasher zeh. In a Christian marriage or in a secular marriage, the clergyman or the individual who is officiating the marriage, they're not simply Mitzvah Kiddushin. They're the one who waves the magic wand, and by their word, they render this man and woman husband and wife. Just say that's what you see on the TV shows, because I've never been to a Christian wedding, and I don't really have any plans of going to any anytime soon. So I only know from television how it works. But I now declare you husband and wife. The rabbi at our wedding ceremonies doesn't declare them husband and wife. He'll say Nikudeshes. I'm pointing out that he accomplished the Mesa. It's not the rabbi who magically declares them. It's not like a Kohen who comes to observe Saras in the house, and only by the declaration of his word does that spotting all of a sudden get a status of Saras, become something.
Just a quick question.
If I may, I'll just finish the formulation here. We're almost at the end of it. This is fundamentally opposed to what our Torah says. So that's another issue. And then he says, next paragraph, the passion, the am ha'arshinu, the maybe club, the either a kiddushin, mahusim, and yom kiddushin. Ain't that we should stumble a shma, who is galakaish, that much Israel, that's Torah with our kiddushin. The only reason that in general someone who's like doesn't understand how kiddushin works in work is because they're being so clear das on the rabbi who buys into the idea of kiddushin to marry that. But here, where someone is relying on something which is fundamentally wrong, the wedding will not work. They will not be married. And if I may, just one more, skip to the next paragraph with the underline, quotes the Rivash. The Rivash says, "Afilu das osma gaon zichron lebracha, shesorg v'stam amin l'shem kiddushin baal." Even if in general we assume that when someone has someone has relations with his wife, it's l'shem kiddushin. Haka benito zeh lo baal l'shem kiddushin. L'chem shehistu b'nistu b'chukas ol l'kochavim b'mosim b'piat komer. Harehu ki'ilu pirshin dait l'shem kiddushin atzmo sheyus avadarche ovdei avodazar she'im v'torah tishin gittin. By one going to a ceremony that's not run according to halacha, it's worse than someone who doesn't understand what's going on. If I get married, and I understand what Kiddushin soon is, but I just say I want to do whatever is the way the Torah prescribes marriage, I'll be married. But when I have das, which is antithetical to Torah, I don't want to follow the way that this person prescribes, that's not called Kiddushin. I will not be married based on that, because I have the wrong kavanah altogether. So that's, and then, sorry, just one last piece that I missed. But legally done, Rav Asher White ties the entire case. You need soon American, they were foremen. Shemechastin, Gam Zugot Urabim, Hari Varish Kol Mirasim Vitas Moshe Yisrael, Eno Elkin Tzitsuk, Hazorzir Vekavanasim Bichukei Adash Shabadu Lima. And so when the conservative reform rabbi uses the words and asks the guy, do you want to be Makadish her? And he said, Hidas Moshe Yisrael, according to how we do things for Moshe and the Jewish people, that's just a tifsa, like it's an incantation that you mean. It doesn't really mean that. All that really means, like what Matthew says, is you go today and people make up their own ceremony. And you're just making up your own ceremony. You're not truly doing Hidas Moshe in Israel, but you're just following what's Bichukei Hadash Badun Liba, according to whatever their gut tells them. So that's, there's a lot more to say, but I try to pick the highlights. Daniel, you're waiting patiently.
So the approach we seem to be doing so far essentially is that we're trying to find every way possible that the original marriage wasn't kosher, therefore there's no problem of mamzerim, right?
Right.
Do they try and look at the other approach as well, which might be that the original marriage was kosher, but we try to find any leniencies to say that the get was also kosher?
Absolutely, and Daniel, I feel like this is a really good dynamic tonight. Everyone who keeps asking a question brings me to the next section. So maybe you guys are just looking at the source sheet trying to get me to move along. So okay, so right, let's just reorient where we are. In order to ensure,
Kurt, sorry to interrupt. I just asked a favor. I wasn't here for the first 2 minutes, and could you just state sort of what the parameter is here that we're at? Because I'm a little lost. I apologize.
The overall scenario, and we really should just reorient ourselves for a moment. We should get to a conclusion soon. Overall, our scenario here is that man and woman get married through a conservative rabbi. We find out that the man the man realized at some point that he's gay, so they get divorced. She marries a second man and has children with him, but the divorce was through a conservative rabbi also. So the concern is that maybe we say that the Kiddushin was valid, but the conservative Beis Din that got them divorced didn't know. We don't know if they knew what they were doing. There's many more minutia, one could argue, to a certain degree when it comes to Gittin than when it comes to Kiddushin. And so the concern is that she's still halachically married to the first man. The children she has from the second man are mamzerim, and that's very serious because they wouldn't be allowed to marry another Jew halachically. Now, there's interesting cases. I think Rav Tendler was involved in this, where basically a shifka kananis, a non-Jewish maidservant owned by a Jew, they're considered like a mikvah l'tahir mamzera. What I mean by that is that a mamzer who marries a mamzeres, a female mamzer, their children will still be mamzera. And so you're just perpetuating a difficulty. So, well, what can you do? A mamzer who marries a shivka kananis, since the child is born to shivka kananis, he doesn't have the status of a mamzer. That's the halacha. So what they did was, they basically, these mamzerim, they married a woman, but what they did was, they acquired them as a non-Jewish maidservant, and then what they did was, they freed them, made them Jewish, and they got married, and they had children from there. That's what I heard. I can't confirm. But what we're trying to do here is to ask, well, if we invalidate the Kiddushin, we have grounds to say they were never married to begin with. The question is to get off the ground. What Daniel now is leading us to is, well, let's say we recognize the marriage is valid. Maybe there's reason to assume the get is not valid. And just before we get to Daniel's point, there's another reason to assume the Kiddushin is not valid, even if we recognize the legitimacy of a wedding performed by a conservative rabbi, even if we grant that premise. Why? So if you turn to page... long shoelace, forgive me. You turn to page Reish Tet Zion on the bottom. I'm not going to go through all of it, but essentially what Rav Asher Weiss says is that we have already precedent in halacha that if a man has a mum or a woman has a mum, meaning they have some sort of blemish or deficiency. It can be physical or non-physical in nature. And the spouse was not aware of it when they got married. Again, we talked about it's called a mekach tos, and it's a agreement made under false pretenses. I didn't have all the facts on the table. And we assess that if this was so serious that the person would never have gotten married had they known that fact, then we actually assume that there was never a Chelos Kiddushin and that they were never married to begin with. So we don't even need to talk about divorce. Now, what could be the mum over here? Otherwise says, "Ein mum gedol mizo." There's no greater mum than the fact that this man is just fundamentally not attracted to her. He says actually it's even worse than a man being sterile or a man being somewhat castrated. Because there, like, you could still do things in halakha, for instance, when one is supposed to pleasure their wife. Pleasuring one's wife is not strictly through intercourse, but chibuk v'nishuk, caressing and kissing, those kind of things also are recognized as a form of ona. Something that's of ona, pleasuring one's wife. So that man can still do certain things. But here, this man is just fundamentally not attracted to this woman. They're fundamentally incompatible. And therefore, he says, and actually, you know what you might say? You might say, oh, well, there used to be a belief that being gay was a choice. Or Rav Asher Weiss, and you can see, in case you didn't know who Rav Asher Weiss was, and when he looked right now, you can see that from the fact that on page Reshut Zion, in that little paragraph there, he says, there's no way to, in his words, heal, there's no way to alter somebody's sexual preference, or what do you call it?
Orientation.
General orientation, sexual orientation.
Right.
Thank you. So there's no way to. I feel like I'm like some old guy in like your 70s right now. Right. So there's no way to change someone's gender orientation. But you think about it, that's a huge change from Rav Moshe Feinstein's Tshuva on homosexuality, where Moshe assumed that people were being gay lahachos, that people were doing it as a choice, and that they did it because they just wanted to. So because being gay is not a choice, and therefore it's just fundamentally part of who the person is. It's irrevocable. There's no greater mum than this, and he says there's grounds to say that the marriage never even got off. That's the point that he makes. The final point I'll just end off with is the get. I don't want to get too much into the get. That was a terrible pun. You turn to page Reish Yud Ches. Rav Asher Weiss actually says that, even though gittin are more complicated, there might be reason to assume that actually the get is not kosher. We say, what do we say? We say, V'ravim and aposim kasu, the kshesh reis of b'pnei b'get over ma'isa based near to mish considered to get lo hayabaki v'tip gittin choshe get patul. We have reason to assume that these people might not know the halachos in general, certainly when it comes to gittin, which is a very specialized area of halacha. I mean, I know only the generality of gittin. I don't specialize. If you ask me all the minutiae of how gittin are done, I can only give you the generalities. The people specialize in these areas. However, Pnei Yeshua says, "Dein halacha zu amura el b'mei kedem shlo seder haget matzoi b'yadam." Back then, there was people didn't know Hilchos Gittin. Nowadays, if someone really wants to learn Hilchos Gittin, there are, do-it-yourself books, so to speak. There's like books from Matt Cronin that basically give you the step-by-step and tell you how it's supposed to be done. It's, almost, you think about it, I don't have it here in my office, but there's something called an RCA life cycle madrid, which, it tells you how to perform a wedding. So it just guides you through the step-by-step in case you forgot everything that you learned in Smicha. I mean, you still need to know certain things, but I didn't tell you that. So there's reason to assume also that the get was done properly. I'm very much fast forwarding. What does that leave us with? We turn to page ratio test. What we have here is a suffix spake speka. In other words, a triple doubt. Usually in halacha, we say one suffix if we're dealing with biblical matters, d'oraisas l'chumra, d'rabanan l'kula, and if you have a spake, a double suffix, we assume that one way to conceptualize it is when you have two doubts, there's not even a doubt in front of me. That's just like so far out, so far fetched that through the lens of halacha, we don't even see it. It's not there. Kalachomer, ben benoshel kalachomer, a suffix speka, where you have three spekos. What are the three spekos that we have? Age ratio test. Suffix vikir Kiddushin. We have one suffix in general, whether the conservative rabbi's marriage works, whether it's valid. Number two, suffix mitzah kiddushay tos. Even if it does, maybe it was kiddushay tos because the person was gay. And number three, the suffix gerushin. Who knows? Maybe the divorce also was a valid divorce. So between all these three considerations, when you put them all together, and especially when we're dealing with the question of mamzerus, where dafka and halacha actually, having to get to your point, in mamzerus, we're actually supposed to try to find who was when we can. Most areas of halacha don't operate that way. Mamzer is so serious that one's supposed to try to be matir if there's grounds to be matir. Therefore, he concludes there's no concern of mamzerus, and therefore, and even she is allowed to continue living with this man. So that's Rav Asher Weiss's conclusion. Now, I was pretty confident when I opened up this tshuva that his conclusion would be Lakula. I mean, after all, that's what he set out to do. He didn't really make it a surprise. But I thought the considerations that he took into account, particularly about what is considered a valid wedding, a marriage, what's not, was very informative. So that's the end of what I wanted to share with you from the tshuva. God willing, unless Sam puts me up for a chabura before Chodesh Adar, once we're even in Adar Rishon, I hope to share with you my shir on Lo Yilvash. I realize there's no way to share the screen. I think there is. Share my entire screen. You know what? I have to learn how to play around with Daniel's Google program. But I'll show you that, God willing, it should be a very fun shir. Lots. Okay.
A question? Yes, sorry. So we're saying in the end that there's a triple doubt, therefore everything's okay. So say the first husband wasn't gay, that means we're left with just a double doubt then, right?
And that probably would still be okay. That would be sufficient.
Okay, so then say that there hasn't even been a divorce yet. Say there's a couple in front of you who had a conservative wedding. Would you advise them to have an orthodox get?
If they had a conservative wedding, right? Are you saying because like one svara I could give, and maybe you're going along these lines, you could tell me is kibolu kach polto. You know, if the conservative guy was good enough to marry them, then the conservative rabbis are good enough to divorce them.
I'm saying, say you knew a conservative couple that got married, and they haven't had the get yet, but would you advise them then to have an orthodox get? Because then they're definitely safe.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would certainly advise that.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the tzad not to advise that?
I guess if the wedding wasn't valid to begin with, maybe they don't even need a get, or maybe a conservative get is fine, or I don't know.
Rav Moshe is tshuva, by the way, and Dan, I appreciate you bringing this out. Rav Moshe actually does, in pressing instances where a get cannot otherwise be given, he says we can rely on this to say that the Kiddushin was never valid to begin with. But even I think Rav Moshe, if memory serves, he said if a get could be given, a get certainly should be done, rather than rely on the disqualification of the conservative nature of the wedding. Okay? But I appreciate you bringing that point out, Daniel, so we can clarify it. Any other questions? All right. Yeah,
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I mean, we probably all have friends or acquaintances that are, that may get married outside of an Orthodox setting, and they quote want their wedding to be, admissible, or I don't know what to, but they're not willing to have an Orthodox ceremony or Orthodox auspices to have that happen. In what way do they sort of, is there any way to, once it's already over and done with, is there any way to ensure that their wedding was valid? Does it matter so much? I'm sure in certain places there, I know that some people, later on in life they become frum and then they get remarried again. I've seen that happen. But is there, are there certain things that just would be enough to consider it sufficient?
Yeah.
Look at kind of the opposite side of things, not where you want to annul the marriage, but where you want to make the marriage
kosher 100, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Kosher. So yeah, it's a great question, Matthew, and I do need to make sure I'm sensitive in how I address it, because we all, maybe someone on here that I'm not aware of, but certainly at very least we all know people who did not necessarily have like an Orthodox rabbi performing the wedding. So what I would say is as follows: there's a few aspects here. As far as Mamzer is concerned, the only time there's Mamzerus is when a man and woman who are, their union would result in an Isser Kares, divine excision, and that union produces a child, that child's a Mamzer. So man and woman living together, there's an Isser likely of actually, what we think of as a prostitute, what we call prostitution in English, is not the same thing. But basically the Isser in the Zona, prostitution is basically having sex outside of marriage. And so these two people living together might still be violating that. That's a concern. But their children are, if the woman's Jewish, the children are completely kosher. They're not mamzera. So it's important. The stakes are not as high, though, as the case we're dealing with here. Now, people who would say they had a conservative wedding, again, if it was done by someone who knew what he was doing, an old-time conservative rabbi, and who the two witnesses were there, and they were halacha-abiding people, then that's fine. If not, then I would ask opposing on this, but I think there's no harm that could be done in redoing it very briefly just to be safe. There's another question also of a ksuba. Halachically, a man and woman cannot live together if they don't have a valid ksuba. So if that ksuba, for instance, had one man and one woman sign on it, which at these egalitarian weddings they'll do things like that might impact the validity of the ksuba, as you don't have two valid kosher witnesses on it, even male. So the ksuba, even in theory, if you accept the fact that they're married, you still may need to look into the validity of the ksuba document and have that be redone. So those are some complications. I'm happy to, if anyone has this question, halacha l'maisa, happy to be a resource in any way that I can. But I guess that's the beauty. This is a theoretical topic, but the implications of the topic we dealt with tonight have hashlochos, they have practical implications, and hopefully we'll do our best to navigate this.
Thank you for addressing them, just of interest.
Yeah, definitely. All right, it's 8:58. We should finish before an hour is out. Thank you so much, guys. I know that your wives are all at some event tonight. you all managed to log on for sheer nonetheless. So I should call out for designating time to learn together. And God willing, the Harry meeting we'll do it in person with food. And I think Steven was willing to host, so we'll rain check it. You'll still have explicit posting Torah, God willing, very soon. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Yasher Koach.
Shkolach. Thank you.